Hi guys, and welcome back to the Vanishing Hour. So, we had a bit of a hiccup that was apparently going on for months that I wasn't aware of until recently, where the last 3, maybe 4 episodes from season 2 and the first episode of season 3 were not uploading to some of the more popular streaming services. I was able to finally figure out what exactly had happened, and it's fixed. So, as of this episode, all streaming services, even the smaller ones, should be up to date with all the episodes available. Also, I wanted to kind of revisit the idea of a Patreon. I wanted your thoughts on if that would be something you're interested in, and if so, what kind of content would you want to see? I've tossed around the idea of bonus episodes, viewer choice episodes, merch, and even video episodes. Being that there's a little more free time to focus on the podcast, I'm thinking of ways to try and support the listeners, support the podcast's growth, and maybe even donate to cases that we cover. These are just some of the long-term goals that I've set for the podcast, so let me know either in the comments section, via social media, YouTube, or email at vanishinghourpodcast@gmail.com. With that being said, though, let's just jump right into today's case. I've found that some of the cases that I've been looking at more recently that are 20 or more years old now are presenting challenges that some of the more recent cases are not presenting. While I am extremely grateful for DNA, forensic, and technological advances that have blown recent cases wide open that would otherwise not be solved, I do think that it's making the older cases that don't have the same means, I guess, seem so much more mountainous and impossible to solve. But I think it's those cases that may have the answers hiding in plain sight. Before DNA and surveillance and all of that, I think murderers were obviously much less cautious and therefore more prone to mistakes. We've seen that in many of the older cold cases that are now getting solved via DNA and other means. Those mistakes, even the most minute, may be hiding in plain sight, and that's sort of the feeling that I got while researching this case. However, I also struggled with this one for some reason too. Every now and again, I sort of start to feel guilty for researching cases and formulating theories and putting them out there in the world. Then I start to think to myself, I have no business poking around in here and making theories or suggestions without operating with all the info. I'm certainly not a professional or expert. And in some ways, there is a lot of truth to that. Then I start to think I can't just not do anything either. I ask myself if this were me or even my loved one who had been missing or murdered and without answers for a year, 5 years, 15 years, or however long, I would hope that at the very least people are still talking, still wondering, still searching, with no stone unturned. I'd hate to believe that I or my loved one just ceased to exist to anyone anymore just because they or I are no longer breathing or can be located. And that's how I have to view this podcast. I try to steer away from dragging people completely without any cause, and I know sometimes it's more successful than other times. But my hope is that people are still remembered and talked about after they're gone. I know I would want to be, especially if my case or my loved one's case was unsolved. All it takes is someone talking about it, and who knows what could happen. With that said, today's case, I believe, is our first Canadian case, if I'm not mistaken. I know I've researched several, and I have many stewing on several burners here, but I think this is our first published one so far. So with that said, this is The Vanishing of David Bowler. David Bowler was murdered on Thursday, January 18th, 2001, in his office on campus at the University of Toronto, located at 1 Spadina Crest, sometime between 1:30 and 2:30 p.m. Somehow, whoever killed David was able to enter and maneuver the building without raising any suspicion, locate David's obscured office location on the second floor, and stab him 7 times before leaving the scene unnoticed. To this day, his killer is unknown. What has made David's case strike a chord with many, including the true crime community, is the nature of which David was killed and some of the finer details of this case. So let's begin by first discussing a little about David and the type of person that he was. David was 50 years old at the time of his death. He was an artist, and his main outlet was painting for many years. His more recent work was beginning to experiment with photography and text integrated with his paintings. Many of the images included what was referred to as homoerotic images, which mainly meant naked men or men dressed in leather or some other material. I think it's important to mention that David was out and gay at the time of his death. Unlike many theories out there circulating, I don't think that this was a motivating factor in his death with regards to a hate crime per se. But I mention it more for the reason being that it was part of his identity, part of his art, and part of who he was. In 2001, there were still many struggles and discriminations faced by members of the LGBT plus community, and David was no stranger to them. But the impression I got from the shift in his work was simply that David had entered a new phase in his art journey where he felt comfortable expressing that aspect of his life through his work. Contrary to his bold artwork, though, David was described as an introvert by nature. He compartmentalized his life very neatly. His art life was one thing, his personal life was another, and his work life as an art professor was another. Despite his artist and professor life maybe influencing each other when appropriate, David was keen on keeping his private life separate. He knew the line between professional and personal, and he never crossed it. He encouraged students to be themselves and to be bold and unafraid in their art. His attitude and outlook made him a very popular professor at the University of Toronto, and oftentimes his lectures were waitlisted and always difficult to get into. His students just simply loved him. David was also instrumental in developing an innovative interdisciplinary master's program in visual studies at the university, which was going to begin the following year. Now, speaking personally, I was a little bummed to see that when going through the University of Toronto website, there was hardly no mention of David anywhere. There was no memorial or mention of him or his hard work at establishing this program on the site. Aside from the David Bowler Memorial Scholarship briefly listed with other scholarships available, there was no mention of him, and I found that to be a little odd, considering the impact he had on students and programs for the school. Maybe I missed something, but that was just a side note that I felt needed to be added in. Karen Sanlos, David's niece, had a very close relationship with her uncle. She actually grew up and became an art professor herself, which I thought was sort of poetic. But she's been the leading hand for these past 20 plus years in pushing for justice for David. Karen stated that at the time of David's death, he was mainly focused on work life and his art. While he was on a couple of dating sites, an investigation later into these sites would reveal that David had not met nor communicated with anyone on them. Karen mirrored this notion by stating that David had told her he wasn't seeing anyone, and he was, quote, okay with that. According to the 2014 episode To Catch a Killer that featured David's case, by the time December of 2000 rolled around, just a few weeks before David's death, a close friend of David's named Andrew Ward had stated that David confided in him about some troubles at work. While not many details about the issues were shared, it did sound like there was some sort of conflict between David and possibly two other redacted faculty members' names. Who they were, their field of work, or the conflict is unknown. Prior to David's death as well, it was mentioned that there was a student who had attended the university, taken David's course, among other professors' courses, and was a bit of a troublemaker. Previous students of David's that were interviewed for the show stated that the student often interrupted lectures by yelling negative comments, and one account stated that the student had brought a knife to class and paced the back of the classroom with it in hand. Now, the latter incident seems very extreme and wasn't entirely clear if this was something that happened just in David's lecture or other professors' lectures as well, or if it was a one-time thing or not. But further digging eventually revealed that this particular student was technically not currently enrolled at the time of David's death and was already in the process of transferring when he was murdered. Regardless, if these events are true, they are noteworthy and something to consider. Personally, if a student came to school with a knife, I would think that would be grounds for expulsion or some sort of criminal charges. I get that this was 2001, but I still think it was a crime then just as much as it is now. The fact that he was still allowed access to campus and other schools for that matter seems kind of strange. But regardless, that brings us to the events of January 18th, 2001. According to the Unsolved Mysteries podcast episode titled Art of Murder, that morning, David and his close friend Paul Castleman spoke on the phone. Paul stated that him and David were close friends and had been for decades. Paul was a photographer in the Toronto area, and so I think that David and him shared a lot of common interests. But Paul stated that he spoke to David that morning via phone. David said that he had to get off the phone and go to campus because he, quote-unquote, had to go to a class for 1 o'clock. According to Paul, the two had plans to connect later that evening, though. In a later interview I found, Paul stated that while he was a straight man, he and David remained close friends who talked regularly. I found this comment about the 1 o'clock class interesting because in all of the digging I did, this was the only source I found and the only person who stated that David was expected to be in a class of some sort at 1 o'clock. As we will quickly find out in just a second here, the actions of David later in the day do not correlate with any sort of class at 1 p.m. The following are the last known movements of David before his murder. At 1 p.m. Thursday afternoon, David was last seen physically in person. One source stated he was seen in his building getting into an elevator by a student, but I couldn't confirm the validity of this statement. But I did find a more solid source that stated he was elsewhere. This source stated he was not in a class like his friend Paul stated he said he would be. Instead, he was talking to another professor at the college in the Sidney Smith building a couple blocks northeast from his office that he would later be murdered in. So, just to give a little lay of the land here so we know where we're at, the University of Toronto, I believe, has 3 campuses in the region. They have a Scarborough campus, the St. George campus, and the, forgive me because I know I'm going to butcher the crap out of this name, Mississauga campus. David was teaching at the St. George campus. The St. George campus is, let's say, roughly 6 to 8 blocks on all 4 sides. The northernmost street is Bloor Street West. The easternmost street is Yonge Street. Again, if I butchered that, I am sorry. The southernmost street appears to be College Street. And lastly, the westernmost street is Spadina Road. There are various side streets throughout this entire area, and the campus is divided into hundreds of buildings, small and big, old and new, and all different shapes and sizes and varying architecture. Actually, the campus is really beautiful. I did a virtual walkthrough, not just of some of the buildings that were available to view, but also just a Google mapping of the roads. And they had images that dated as far back as 2007. And it's just a very picturesque area, and it doesn't really feel like a campus. It's not closed off and alienated from the surroundings like some campuses are. I enjoyed it. Also, it should be noted that some of the buildings outside of the boundary were also considered campus buildings, and some within the boundary were not campus related. So this is just a rough border that I gave you. But David's building was located on the very southwesternmost corner of this border that I gave you. This corner, which is where Spadina and College Street meet, quickly turns into a roundabout referred to as Spadina Crescent. And smack dab in the middle of that roundabout is what was referred to at the time as the Connaught Building. Today it is known as the Daniels Building. This building was home to the Visual Arts Department, David's office, and I think some other branches of the art department, maybe even the architecture department as well, if I remember correctly. And it was even home to some small businesses on the first floor. At the time of his murder, directly below David's office, which was on the second of 4 floors of the building, was an optometry business, kind of what I picture to be like a lens crafters. This building has since gone under a massive remodeling, and very modern additions were made to this building. but it's a beautiful building. It's definitely an older, like Renaissance era type of building. It's dark and gothic, and it has arched windows and arched hallways, and it has this grand creaky staircase at the front entrance area, and there's ivy growing all over the front face of it. It's a beautiful building. Also, sidebar, the addition really just does not flow with the building. I know that is completely insignificant, but it stood out like a really sore thumb to me when I was looking at pictures of it, so I just wanted to throw that in there. But anyway, I thought the building was beautiful. I loved it, and I could totally see how David must have loved coming to work every day and taking in how moody and unique his office building was. But back to the timeline. So we know that David's office building was at the southwesternmost area of campus. The Sidney Smith building, where he was last seen by anyone in person other than his killer, of course, is 1 block north and 1 block east from his office building, so maybe a 5 to 10 minute walk from his office. Now, sources stated that the Sidney Smith building also held a few art department offices or rooms there as well, so there was a relevance between David and why he was probably there. But he was seen speaking to a female faculty member there at 1 p.m. At 1:09 p.m., we know David returns to his office. We know this because the computer in his office starts up. Police were able to take his computer and analyze the hard drive data to see the last actions on it. We know it was David because at 1:10 p.m. he uses his office phone to call the same female professor he was seen speaking with. We assume she doesn't answer because David leaves a voicemail for her. The exact contents of the voicemail are not mentioned, but it's stated that it is all strictly business related. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, the first floor housed an eye clinic or an optometry business of some sort, and that was directly below David's office. Now, a couple sources stated that there was a retirement party going on at this time, while other sources stated that it was a baby shower. Then some sources stated that there was upwards of 100 people at this party, while other sources stated it was only maybe 8 to 10 people. This was very confusing for me because I'm not sure how you cross wires between a retirement party or a baby shower and the obvious vast difference in attendees. But regardless, it's safe to say that some sort of party was taking place below David's office on the first floor, and there was multiple people in attendance. At approximately 1:30 p.m., several people at this party stated that they heard a loud altercation taking place on the floor above them that lasted only a couple of seconds. They couldn't distinguish what was being said or if the voices were more masculine or feminine, but that shortly after the altercation they heard what was described as a thud. That seems to be the end of whatever disturbance they heard, though, and they essentially carried on with their party until about 1:45 p.m., when people started to leave and clean up and whatnot. At 1:58 p.m., we know that whoever is on David's computer, whether it be him or someone else, is looking at a painting. At 2:02 p.m., the user of the computer opens AppleWorks, which I guess is like the paint program. I'm not an Apple user, so don't come for me. But the user opens the program and begins to quote-unquote doodle, as one of the detectives put it. It's stated that this doodle was released to the public, but I have never seen it, and I dug for this thing hours upon hours upon hours, and I found not so much as a scrap of it, but a description of the drawing was given. The image contains 2 men, I'm assuming one on each end of the drawing, and they are facing each other. The detectives stated that one of the men was wearing glasses, and they sort of just assumed that it was meant to be David because David also wore glasses, and I'm guessing it must have resembled him. Mind you, if this was drawn by David, he is an artist, so I'm sure this wasn't just some sort of stick figure with 2 circles drawn around his eyes. The other man, however, is seemingly unknown to detectives, and he's got both hands tied above his head in some sort of bondage position, as they put it. It wasn't entirely clear if the men were naked or not, or any other context to the image. At 2:21 p.m., however, the image is saved as is to the hard drive of David's computer. This is where things started to get a little weird for me, though, because at 2:24 p.m., the image is actually printed to David's office printer, but it's not quite the same image anymore. This printed version contains a 6-worded phrase that police have withheld from the public and continue to this day. This phrase they feel is pertinent to the case and that it is in direct association to the murder. I believe one detective worded it as being a motivating factor in the murder. Now, weirdly enough, the words were added to the image and then the image was printed, but the image was not then resaved to the hard drive with the changes. Then at 2:25 p.m., the plug of David's computer is pulled out of the power socket and the computer, of course, shuts off. Now, there is no other activity that can be traced until about 4 p.m. David has a regularly scheduled lecture at this time, and lectures were something that David not only never missed, but was definitely never late to. So when he doesn't show up to his 4 p.m. lecture or his 6 p.m. lecture, some of his students actually become concerned and go looking for him. The first place that they decide to check is his office. At about 6:30 p.m., they knocked on his door for several minutes and got no response. Now, I don't know if his office had windows, but I'm assuming if it did, and it was ones that faced the interior of the building, they must have been covered. Otherwise, someone would have seen something and obviously freaked out. David's office was essentially a broom closet by all accounts. It was an office within a larger office and had other smaller either offices or cubicles across from it, according to the original blueprints before the remodel happened. His office has since been knocked down, and I think it's part of a library now, if I read that correctly. It's either a library or an art lecture room. But regardless, the students knocked. They even tried the doorknob, but it was locked. Being that they probably didn't know what else to do at this point, they figured maybe an emergency came up and he had no time to notify the students or anything like that. So the students simply left for the evening. David's friend Paul, who said he spoke to David the morning of and had plans to connect with him that evening, stated that when he called David and got his voicemail that evening, he just assumed David must have been tired and had gone to bed early. He figured he would call him or see him the next day. Being that it sounds like David was such a punctual person who was a great communicator, I did wonder if falling asleep without calling or, texting or emailing someone expecting to hear from him was a normal thing. I obviously didn't know him at all, so my opinion is worth nothing, but I just didn't get the impression that sounded like David, and I wondered if others close to him could corroborate that or not. But on Friday, January 19th, 2001, the very next day, a faculty cleaning woman begins her rounds for cleaning the offices. At about 6:30 a.m., she reaches David's office, proceeds to unlock his door and go inside. There she finds, in this small rectangular office, David lying on his right side in a massive pool of blood, deceased. She immediately called campus security, who notified the police. Now, the investigators at the scene said that this was a scene unlike many that they had come across. For starters, despite the close quarters and the violent nature of David's death, they described the scene as quiet. By this, they meant hardly anything was disturbed in the office. There was no signs of a struggle or a fight, and there was no giant mess of blood around the room. It was all centralized to David's location. Aside from the computer being unplugged and David's chair lying on its side with David next to it, there was no other real disturbances. The cord to the computer was actually alleged to have been wrapped around the leg of the chair. Investigators believed that when David was attacked and fell over in the chair must have yanked the cable right out of the wall. Investigators stated David was dressed in black pants, a blue shirt, and black shoes. He had been stabbed a total of 7 times. 1 was sort of to the back left shoulder, and 6 were to the upper body and chest area. With the amount of blood at the scene, investigators immediately requested luminol testing for, quote, every doorknob in the building. They believed with this amount of blood, there was no way that the killer couldn't have left some sort of trail. Shockingly enough, though, none of the surfaces tested throughout the entire building reacted with any of the blood indicating tests. Not a single one. Stabbing someone is a very close contact attack. It would be impossible to not get blood on yourself, or your clothing, or your hands, or your shoes. And with cast off flinging all over the place, if you're stabbing somebody multiple times, there should be blood somewhere on the perpetrator. But with no blood on any knobs, that is sort of indicative of protective gear of some sort. His office did not come equipped with a sink to wash your hands after stabbing him. Knowing that, I'm sure it's probably less likely they would have found fingerprints as well. My mind is thinking it's January in Toronto. I'm sure it's pretty cold, if not snowing. Winter gloves or mitts could be a very normal item to walk into a building or room with on and not disturb someone or frighten them in any way. Karen, David's niece, said that at some point, when she was notified of her uncle's death and had made her way to the scene, she too was struck by the quietness of the scene and the obscure location of David's office. She said it was not an office that you easily stumble upon. When she made it there, she also noticed that a filing cabinet next to the door had a card standing upright. I thought this was an interesting observation because you would think that if someone had left hastily or there was some sort of struggle, that things would shift or knock over, but a card, something as light as a feather, remained standing on the filing cabinet right next to the door. With all the blood on the ground, I didn't read or find any mention of a blood footprint trail whatsoever, and this was odd to me. I felt I could explain away the no blood on the doorknobs with gloves or some sort of protective gear over your hands that could have been switched out or removed, being that it's a college, someone with a backpack or a bag that's secretly stuffed with an extra change of clothing wouldn't be out of place. But shoes usually seem to be something less likely that are switched out of. And when somebody is stabbed 7 times but leaves no footprints of blood, it's a little odd to me. I think it's probably important to mention here some of the coroner's findings regarding the stab wounds. They believe that based on the location, entrance, depth, and other unnamed factors, that the weapon was a 5 to 6 inch knife. The wounds were inflicted with a very confident movement, meaning there were no hesitation stabs, and they were very swift and clean in and out. There were minimal signs of resistance, which would speak to the probability that David likely never saw the attack coming. He had no chance to sort of fight off the attacker, and being that the scene is so quiet, as everyone puts it, that would also make sense. Lastly, the wounds suggested that David's attacker was standing behind him when he was stabbed, likely stabbing him in the shoulder and then proceeding to stab him in the chest area. With being so close in proximity, the likelihood that his attacker didn't get blood on them is relatively low in my mind. Another thing that I wanted to point out was that one of the original investigators was perturbed by the fact that David seemingly didn't put up a fight. The medical examiner explained that with the wounds that David suffered, he would have had approximately 2 minutes before bleeding out. In that time, it doesn't appear that David reacted or attempted to fight off his attacker in any way. This really puzzled the investigator. He felt that after the first stab, there should have been some sort of struggle. None of the wounds after should have been as clean as they were, and there should have been, blood smears, whether on the ground or the desk or, a disheveling of papers or other items within the small area, but there wasn't. And while I get where he's coming from and agree to some extent, I also think that maybe David was just in shock. If this was a person he trusted enough to have in his office, allow them in and turn his back to them while working on his computer, knowing how private David was with his compartmentalized life, it's likely this was a person David knew fairly well and trusted. Therefore, to be stabbed by them 7 times quickly could have just sent him into some sort of shock. It could have taken him time to sort of process what was happening to him and why, and before you know it, he's gone. I don't think that's far out of the realm of possibility as far as an explanation as to why the scene was so quiet. Now, initially, investigators had to start with the more obvious leads. One that was brought to their attention was the possibility of this being a hate crime. Being a gay man and a professor at a very well-known college, it had to be considered. But given the nature of the crime, the location of his office, and how difficult it would be to locate for someone without knowledge of its location, that seems unlikely. They also never found any evidence to support that theory as well. It doesn't sound like attacks on the gay community were a high concern at this time or in this area. Another unlikely angle that was brought to investigators' attention was the jilted lover angle. Whispers of a lurid affair began to swarm, baseless rumors. An extensive investigation found no evidence of any affairs with students or otherwise. Investigators scoured the dating sites that David was on and even went so far as to go undercover to try and sniff out leads, but found nothing. No evidence David was in any relationship at the time, or had been recently, or was having trouble with an ex-lover either. A nearby mental hospital was then brought into the mix, and many considered the possibility of maybe a deranged or mentally ill person stumbling into the building and attacking David. But the facts and evidence to this didn't lend any support to that theory as well. The only real theories that began to grow legs was the one hostile student who had been harassing teachers, David included. This student was looked into after several students came forward stating they saw him on campus somewhere. Again, big campus and no specific area was given. I did read in some sources that library was stated, but this campus had multiple libraries and it was never clarified which. But this student was looked into and they admitted to being on campus 24 hours before the murder. But they also had an alibi that put them more than an hour away at the time of the murder. Bank surveillance captured this student far away from the scene as well. Now, the To Catch a Killer episode that I mentioned earlier had tested the theory to see how long it could take the student to get from where his alibi said he was to the crime scene, and they used several different modes of transportation. They felt that the alibi wasn't as strong as police felt and maybe wrote it off a little too soon. But ultimately, the student was cleared. While there are good points of motive and suspicion, David trusted the person who killed him. He turned his back to whoever this person was. I don't think a former student who threatened him with a knife, allegedly, would be someone he would let into his office and possibly be discussing artwork with or turn his back to. Investigators, family, and friends of David's believe his killer is someone much more close to his inner circle. Most seem to believe it was a faculty member. And I'll be honest, this is a strong theory. Initially, this was a theory I was heavily leaning towards as well, and it's still one that I think is very plausible. But as I continued to research, I started noticing some small inconsistencies, and it was having me look in a completely different direction. When we look at a murder case, a very plausible point to start out would be a motive. Who would want this person dead? In this case, who would be mad enough at David to want him dead? I think that's where the hate crime theory, the faculty member theory, and the student theory hold water. Hate crimes are obviously motivated by hate. The victim represents whatever the perpetrator is mad or hateful at. In this case, many suspected that David's sexual orientation or new turn in his artwork could be a reason. But without any supporting evidence, though, that theory falls flat rather quickly. The student and the faculty member theory both could be plausible. With the student, we know this person was angry, prone to outbursts, and allegedly had come to class with a knife. Being a student who has taken David's course would also give him the knowledge of where the office would be located. The same goes for the faculty member, and that is a very important point to keep in mind. The scene doesn't speak to a random spur-of-the-moment attack, but rather a planned, calculated, and knowledgeable attack. An angry student or a jealous or angry faculty member both present strong motives. We don't know much about the alleged conflict between David and the faculty member or members he was allegedly having issues with. Some sources stated it could be related to the new master's program that David was helping spearhead and a possible promotion in the future. Without David around, it's possible whoever this person was would have greatly benefited from his absence. When trying to track down who replaced David after his death or who ended up in a better position faculty-wise after his passing, it was surprisingly difficult to find anyone or anything related to that. Being that this was about 22 years ago now, the online faculty members listed aren't guaranteed to have been the same ones in those same positions shortly after his death, so that left me at a dead end. Ultimately, what we do know about David's murderer is that they had to have known where David's office location was. They had to have known that on that particular day, at that particular time, he would be in that office, not in a lecture and not in another building. This person was either extremely close to David, enough to know his schedule on a day-to-day basis, or they were stalking him to some degree. This person put a certain level of planning into his murder. This doesn't have the markings of a spontaneous killing. This person arrived at a very public building in the middle of the week on a Thursday, armed with a knife. They made their way through the building, located the office, and was able to gain access without breaking in, which indicates that David must have been expecting them or was comfortable enough to allow them in. And then they proceeded to stab David 7 times without hesitation, leave the scene without leaving behind fingerprints, blood, or any witnesses seeing them exit his office or the area for that matter. This person either blended in with the rest of the surroundings, meaning anyone who saw them knew them to be regulars in the building and therefore didn't take notice, or this person was able to successfully evade eyes and leave the scene. The building and immediate surrounding area was not equipped with any sort of surveillance cameras at the time. Whether or not this person knew that or not remains unclear. If they didn't know that, they just happened to be very lucky. Where I start to split hairs, though, are things like the drawing on the computer and the thud in the timeline. If a thud was heard at 1:30 by partygoers downstairs, preceded by a brief yelling altercation, one would assume that more than likely that was the assault and the chair falling to the floor. If that is true, that means that all of the activity after that would not have been David, but rather his killer. But why kill the man and then proceed to draw a very seemingly random image on his computer, save it, then add a 6-worded phrase to it, and then print it and leave the image on the printer before leaving? Without knowing what the phrase was, one can only really speculate. But if investigators felt it was essentially the key motive to the killing, it really makes you wonder what that phrase could have been. We then, though, have to consider if the thud was accurately heard at 1:30. It sounds like partygoers were pretty confident that that is about the time that they heard it. But if it's not the time of death, then did David remain in his office with his killer until shortly before 2:30 after having an altercation of some sort? Was this an argument about the drawing? Was this a collaboration with another artist that turned into a violent altercation? If that were true, that would also mean that this person just casually arrived at his office with a knife, just in case. And that seems far-fetched. It all leads back to premeditation. This conflict, whether one-sided or two, was brewing at some point prior to his death and led his perpetrator to come to David's office prepared to stab him and leave no mess behind. Another notch on the faculty member side of things was that there was a particular staff member alleged to have been in conflict with David over something prior to his death. This faculty member worked in the same building and was there that day, conducting interviews every 20 minutes in their own office, one floor above David's. This person would have had access to the building, would blend in being a staff member with a reason to be there, and he would have a place to sort of hide out or change or whatever after murdering David. Like I said, the faculty member theory always held a very decent amount of water. However, my personal theory is that whoever murdered David was someone who knew him better than the faculty member. Remember how I stated earlier in the episode that some of the minute details are hiding in plain sight? I really do believe that's the case with David's murder. This person would not only have to know where David would be Thursday afternoon, but would know where his office was, and either had plans with David to meet at his office or knew that if they showed up unexpectedly, David would welcome them into his office with open arms. This person would have had to have known he had no other meetings or places to be in the immediate time after his death as well. This person probably knew he didn't have class until 4 p.m. and therefore had a few hours before anyone would even come looking for David. And if David was in fact murdered at the time the thud was heard at 1:30, this person would have had to have been familiar enough with David's laptop and his artwork enough to know how to work his computer and recreate a drawing that could pass as David's work. Being that David had in recent time before his death started incorporating text into his images and paintings, this person had to have known that. A lot of the homoerotic images that David used in his art were photographs. I don't know if these were photographs taken by him or a colleague or a friend in photography, but if they were, this person would know that David's newer art looked a certain way and could imitate it. I feel that more than likely the image on the computer was used as a sort of red herring. I think while words may be of significance, the image is meant to confuse and throw off the investigation. Being that the words were added hastily after the image was saved and then printed, I do not believe David created the image. I also take issue with the statements that David was allegedly supposed to be in class at 1 p.m., but obviously was not. I also take issue with the fact that after not hearing from David that evening, the assumption was made that David just went to bed without canceling or calling. At the end of the day, my theory is that David's killer was a close confidant within his inner circle. Very close. Someone he would call a friend. Someone familiar with his art as well. Not like a fan, but maybe even someone he bounced ideas off of or possibly collaborated with. I have my theories on motive, but they are pure speculation and have no factual evidence to support them. Therefore, I don't want to just throw them out there without supportive evidence and then get in trouble. However, I have a list of questions that I feel, if I could get the answers to, may actually shed some light on a motive or even provide a fresh avenue to investigate. Every stone deserves to be unturned in every case, this one included. And the stone I have doesn't appear to have been publicly unturned yet. At least nothing I could find suggested as much. 22 years is a long time to wait for answers. My only hope is that sometime in the near future, David's case is solved and Karen and the rest of David's family can find a shred of peace. Until next time, guys, stay safe.